The sun had barely risen over Kensington Palace when Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews received the call that would define her career. As head of the Royal Protection Unit, she had handled many sensitive situations, but nothing quite like this. Princess Charlotte, now 25 and increasingly involved in royal duties, had discovered something troubling during her morning walk through the palace gardens. Sarah arrived at the palace within minutes, her mind racing through possibilities. The gates opened smoothly as her unmarked vehicle approached, the familiar sight of the grand entrance doing little to calm her nerves this morning. Something in the urgent tone of the call suggested this was far more serious than the usual security concerns they handled. Princess Charlotte was waiting in the blue drawing room, her usually composed demeanor showing cracks of frustration and concern. She stood by the tall windows overlooking the gardens, her hands clasped tightly behind her back. The morning light caught the determination in her eyes as she turned to face the detective. "Inspector Matthews, thank you for coming so quickly," Charlotte began, her voice carrying the authority she had developed over years of public service. "I need to show you something that I discovered this morning, and I want you to know that I expect a thorough investigation." Sarah had worked with the royal family for over a decade, but she had never seen Princess Charlotte this focused and determined. There was something different about her today, a sense of purpose that went beyond her usual royal duties. The young princess had always been known for her strong sense of justice, but this seemed personal. Charlotte led her through the palace corridors, past portraits of ancestors, and ornate decorations that spoke of centuries of history. They walked in measured steps, Charlotte's heels clicking against the polished floors as servants and staff members bowed respectfully as they passed. The princess acknowledged each with a brief nod, but her mind was clearly elsewhere. They stopped at a side entrance that led to the staff quarters, an area of the palace that few members of the royal family ever visited. Charlotte had discovered this particular section during her morning routine, something that had become a habit since she had taken on more responsibilities within the royal household. She believed in understanding every aspect of the palace operations. "I was conducting my usual morning inspection," Charlotte explained as they approached a heavy wooden door. "I wanted to ensure that all our staff members were being properly cared for and that their working conditions met the standards we expect as a family committed to fairness and dignity." The door opened to reveal a narrow staircase leading to the basement levels of the palace. Sarah had been down here before during security sweeps, but she had never paid close attention to the living conditions of the lower-level staff. The air was noticeably cooler and damper as they descended, the grandeur of the palace above giving way to more utilitarian surroundings. At the bottom of the stairs, they entered a corridor lined with small rooms that served as quarters for some of the palace's cleaning and maintenance staff. The contrast with the luxury above was stark, but what caught Sarah's attention immediately was the condition of these rooms. Many showed signs of neglect, with peeling paint, inadequate heating, and furniture that looked like it had not been replaced in decades. Charlotte opened one of the doors to reveal a cramped space barely large enough for a single bed and a small dresser. The walls were stained with moisture, and there was a musty smell that suggested poor ventilation. A small window near the ceiling provided the only natural light, and it was partially blocked by grime that had accumulated over time. "This is where Maria Santos has been living for the past 3 years, Charlotte said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "She's one of our most dedicated cleaning staff members, working 6 days a week to maintain the staterooms where we receive dignitaries and hold official functions." Sarah examined the room more closely, noting the personal touches that Maria had added to make the space more livable. Family photographs were arranged carefully on the dresser, and a small religious icon hung on the wall. Despite the poor conditions, it was clear that someone was trying to make this place a home. Charlotte continued her explanation as they moved to the next room, which was in even worse condition. "What disturbs me most is that I had no idea these conditions existed. As a member of this family, I should have been aware of how our people were living. This is not just a failure of oversight, it's a failure of our values." The second room belonged to James Williams, a maintenance worker who had been with the palace for over 15 years. The ceiling showed signs of water damage, and there was a bucket in one corner that had clearly been placed to catch drips during rainy weather. The single heating unit was old and appeared to be functioning poorly. I've spoken with several of the staff members this morning, Charlotte said as they examined the room. They've been hesitant to complain about these conditions because they're grateful for their jobs and don't want to seem ungrateful. Many of them come from difficult backgrounds and see working at the palace as an honor, despite these living situations. Sarah began taking detailed notes and photographs, her investigative instincts kicking in. She could see that this was not simply a matter of maintenance oversight. The systematic nature of the poor conditions suggested something more deliberate, possibly involving budget allocation or intentional neglect by someone in a position of authority. As they moved through more rooms, Charlotte's determination only grew stronger. She had discovered that over 20 staff members were living in similar conditions, all of them essential workers who kept the palace running smoothly. These were people who cleaned the rooms where international leaders stayed, who maintained the gardens where official ceremonies took place, and who ensured that every public event ran flawlessly. I want to know who made the decisions that led to this situation, Charlotte stated firmly as they completed their tour of the basement quarters. I want to know who approved these living arrangements, who has been responsible for maintenance and upgrades, and why no one in our administration brought these conditions to the attention of the family. Sarah could see that this had become more than just a housing issue for Princess Charlotte. It had become a matter of principle and leadership. The young royal clearly felt a deep responsibility for everyone who worked to support the monarchy, and she was not going to let this situation continue without accountability. They returned to the main levels of the palace, where Charlotte led Sarah to a small office she used for her personal charitable work. The walls were lined with photographs from her various humanitarian projects, reminding both women of Charlotte's long-standing commitment to social justice issues. This discovery in her own home had clearly struck a personal chord. I need you to conduct a full investigation, Charlotte said as she took a seat behind her desk. I want to know the chain of responsibility that has allowed these conditions to persist. I want to understand the budget allocations for staff accommodations over the past 5 years. And I want to identify any individuals who may have been negligent in their duties or, worse, deliberately maintaining these conditions. Sarah understood the complexity of what Charlotte was requesting. An investigation within the royal household would require delicate handling, involving interviews with staff members who might be reluctant to speak openly, examination of financial records that could implicate senior administrators, and potentially uncovering a culture of neglect that had been allowed to flourish unchecked. Your Royal Highness, I want to assure you that I will conduct this investigation with the thoroughness and discretion it deserves, Sarah responded. However, I need you to understand that we may uncover information that could be uncomfortable for the palace administration. Are you prepared for the possibility that this investigation might reveal systemic problems that go beyond simple oversight? Charlotte's response was immediate and unwavering. Inspector Matthews, my family's reputation should be built on how we treat the people who serve us, not on hiding problems when they arise. If there are systemic issues, then we need to address them completely and transparently. I would rather deal with temporary embarrassment than allow good people to continue living in conditions that fall far short of our values. As their meeting concluded, Sarah could see that Princess Charlotte had made a decision that would likely have far-reaching consequences for the palace administration. The young royal was clearly prepared to challenge established systems and demand accountability, regardless of how uncomfortable it might make certain individuals within the palace hierarchy. Sarah left the palace that morning with a clear mandate and a growing sense that this investigation would reveal much more than poor living conditions. Princess Charlotte's determination to find out who's responsible had set in motion a process that would likely expose decades of administrative negligence and possibly deliberate misconduct. The detective spent the remainder of the day planning her investigation strategy, knowing that she would need to balance thoroughness with discretion. She would have to interview staff members who might fear retaliation, examine financial records that could reveal uncomfortable truths, and ultimately present findings that could lead to significant changes within one of Britain's most important institutions. As evening approached, Sarah reflected on Princess Charlotte's words and commitment to justice. The young royal had demonstrated a level of moral leadership that impressed the experienced detective, and it was clear that this investigation would test not only Sarah's professional skills, but also the palace's willingness to confront difficult truths about itself. Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews began her investigation the following Monday morning, arriving at Kensington Palace before dawn to avoid drawing attention to her presence. She had spent the weekend developing a comprehensive strategy that would allow her to gather information systematically while maintaining the confidentiality that Princess Charlotte had requested. Her first stop was the palace's Human Resources Department, located in a modern office building adjacent to the main palace structure. The contrast between the historic grandeur of the royal residence and the sterile efficiency of the administrative offices was immediately apparent. Here, among filing cabinets and computer terminals, she hoped to find the paper trail that would explain how the deplorable living conditions had been allowed to persist. Margaret Thompson, the long-serving Human Resources Director, greeted Sarah with professional courtesy but obvious nervousness. Margaret had been with the palace administration for over 20 years and had witnessed many changes in management and policy. Her office was meticulously organized, with personnel files arranged in perfect order and every document properly labeled and dated. Inspector Matthews, I understand you're conducting some kind of review regarding staff accommodations. Margaret began cautiously. I want to assure you that we've always followed established procedures and guidelines in all personnel matters. Sarah could sense the defensive tone in Margaret's voice, suggesting that the HR director was already aware of potential problems but had been reluctant to address them. This defensive attitude would become a recurring theme throughout Sarah's investigation as she encountered multiple administrators who seemed more concerned with protecting themselves than addressing legitimate concerns. Mrs. Thompson, I need to review all documentation related to staff housing assignments, maintenance requests, and budget allocations for employee accommodations over the past 5 years, Sarah stated clearly. I also need to understand the decision-making process for determining which staff members are assigned to on-site housing versus off-site arrangements. Margaret's discomfort became more apparent as she began pulling files from various cabinets. The documents revealed a complex system of housing assignments that seemed to lack clear criteria or consistent standards. Some long-term employees were housed in the basement quarters Sarah had seen, while newer staff members with similar positions had been provided with more modern accommodations in converted buildings on the palace grounds. The maintenance records were particularly revealing. Sarah discovered that numerous work orders had been submitted over the years requesting repairs and improvements to the basement quarters, but most had been marked as deferred or under review, without any follow-up action. The pattern suggested systematic neglect rather than simple oversight. Mrs. Thompson, can you explain why these maintenance requests were repeatedly postponed? Sarah asked, pointing to a thick file of unresolved work orders dating back 3 years. Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her chair before responding. Those decisions were made at a higher level than my department. We submitted the requests as required, but the approval for expenditures had to come from the palace operations manager and ultimately from the deputy private secretary's office. This information pointed Sarah toward the next phase of her investigation. She would need to examine the administrative hierarchy that controlled palace operations and understand how decisions were made regarding staff welfare. The trail was leading her toward more senior positions within the palace management structure. Her next appointment was with David Richardson, the palace operations manager, whose office occupied an entire floor of the administrative building. David had been in his position for 7 years and was responsible for overseeing all aspects of palace maintenance, security coordination, and staff management. His office reflected his status, with expensive furniture and artwork that contrasted sharply with the basement rooms Sarah had examined. David's approach was significantly different from Margaret's defensive posture. He appeared confident and slightly dismissive, suggesting that he viewed Sarah's investigation as an unnecessary disruption to normal palace operations. His attitude immediately raised red flags for the experienced detective. Inspector, I'm not sure what concerns have been raised, but I can assure you that palace operations run according to well-established protocols, David began. We manage a complex institution with hundreds of employees and multiple facilities. Compromises and priorities are inevitable in any large organization. Sarah presented David with copies of the maintenance requests that had been deferred from his office. She watched his reaction carefully as he reviewed documents that clearly showed his signature on rejection forms and budget denials. His confidence began to waver as he realized the extent of the documentation Sarah had already gathered. These decisions were made based on budget constraints and competing priorities, David explained, but his tone had become more defensive. We have limited resources for maintenance and improvements, and we have to focus on areas that affect public functions and official ceremonies. Mr. Richardson, help me understand the budget allocation process, Sarah continued. How do you determine which maintenance requests receive priority, and who reviews your decisions? David's explanation revealed a troubling pattern of priorities that consistently placed staff welfare at the bottom of the list. Funding was readily available for cosmetic improvements to public areas, upgraded technology for administrative offices, and enhanced security measures, but requests for basic improvements to staff living conditions were routinely denied or postponed indefinitely. Sarah discovered that David had discretionary authority over maintenance budgets up to £50,000 annually, meaning that most of the deferred improvements could have been completed without higher-level approval. The basement quarters could have been renovated multiple times over with the funding that had been allocated to other projects during David's tenure. The investigation took a more serious turn when Sarah examined David's personal financial records, which her position allowed her to access as part of the security clearance review process. She discovered evidence of significant personal expenditures that appeared to exceed his official salary, including expensive home renovations, luxury vehicle purchases, and frequent high-end vacation travel. Further investigation revealed that David had been receiving payments from several contractors who performed work at the palace. These payments appeared to be kickbacks for awarding contracts, with David deliberately choosing higher-priced vendors who were willing to share their profits in exchange for guaranteed palace business. The money saved by avoiding staff accommodation improvements was being redirected to inflated contracts that benefited David personally. Sarah's investigation expanded to include a forensic examination of palace procurement records over the past 5 years. She discovered a pattern of inflated contracts for routine maintenance work, with certain vendors receiving disproportionate amounts of business despite submitting higher bids than their competitors. These vendors had been performing substandard work while charging premium prices, creating a system of corruption that enriched both David and his business partners. The scope of the financial misconduct was staggering. Sarah calculated that over £200,000 had been misappropriated through inflated contracts and kickback arrangements during David's tenure as operations manager. This money could have completely renovated the staff quarters multiple times over and provided proper living conditions for all palace employees. As Sarah compiled her evidence, she began interviewing the staff members who had been living in the substandard conditions. These conversations were conducted discreetly, often during off hours or in locations away from the palace to ensure that employees felt safe speaking honestly about their experiences. Maria Santos, the cleaning staff member whose room Princess Charlotte had shown to Sarah, revealed that she had submitted multiple requests for basic repairs over the past 2 years. She had been told repeatedly that her requests were being processed, but no work had ever been performed. Maria had eventually stopped submitting requests because she feared being seen as a complainer who might lose her position. James Williams, the maintenance worker, provided even more disturbing information. He revealed that he had been instructed by David Richardson to perform only minimal maintenance on the basement quarters, focusing on immediate safety issues while ignoring comfort and habitability concerns. James had been uncomfortable with these instructions, but had followed them to protect his job. Other staff members shared similar experiences of being ignored, dismissed, or subtly threatened when they raised concerns about their living conditions. A culture of fear had developed among the lower-level employees, who understood that complaining could result in termination or transfer to less desirable positions. Sarah's investigation also uncovered evidence that David had been deliberately hiring contractors known for poor quality work because they were willing to participate in his kickback scheme. This explained why many of the repairs that had been approved and funded had failed quickly, requiring additional work that generated more opportunities for financial misconduct. The pattern of corruption extended beyond simple financial theft. David had been systematically undermining the welfare of palace staff to create more opportunities for personal enrichment. He had cultivated relationships with vendors who shared his lack of ethical standards and had created a network of corruption that affected multiple aspects of palace operations. As Sarah prepared to present her preliminary findings to Princess Charlotte, she realized that the investigation had revealed far more serious problems than anyone had initially suspected. What had begun as a concern about poor living conditions had evolved into a comprehensive examination of administrative corruption that threatened the integrity of the entire palace operation. The evidence clearly showed that David Richardson had been the primary architect of the staff housing problems, using his position to enrich himself while deliberately ignoring the welfare of the people who depended on palace employment for their livelihoods. His actions had created a system of exploitation that was entirely contrary to the values that the royal family claimed to represent. Sarah knew that presenting these findings would have significant consequences for palace administration and would likely result in criminal charges against David Richardson. The investigation had revealed not just negligence, but deliberate misconduct that had harmed numerous innocent people while enriching a corrupt administrator who had betrayed the trust placed in him. Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews requested an urgent meeting with Princess Charlotte after discovering the extent of corruption within the palace administration. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning in Charlotte's private study, away from the main administrative areas where their conversation might be overheard by individuals who could be implicated in the investigation. Princess Charlotte arrived at the meeting with a determined expression that had become familiar to Sarah over the past week. The young royal had been following the investigation closely, and her commitment to uncovering the truth had only strengthened as more evidence emerged. She took her seat across from Sarah, ready to hear whatever difficult information the detective had discovered. "Your Royal Highness, I need to inform you that this investigation has revealed problems far more serious than we initially suspected," Sarah began. "What appeared to be negligence regarding staff accommodations has actually uncovered a systematic pattern of corruption and financial misconduct that has been operating within the palace administration for several years." Charlotte leaned forward, her attention completely focused on Sarah's words. "Please tell me everything you've discovered. I need to understand the full extent of what has been happening in my family's household." Sarah presented her findings methodically, starting with the evidence of financial misconduct and moving through the documentation that showed how staff welfare had been deliberately sacrificed for personal enrichment. Charlotte's expression grew increasingly serious as she absorbed the implications of what Sarah had uncovered. The palace operations manager, David Richardson, has been operating what amounts to a kickback scheme with maintenance contractors, Sarah explained. He has been approving inflated contracts in exchange for personal payments, while simultaneously denying basic improvements to staff living conditions to create more opportunities for corrupt contracting arrangements. Charlotte studied the financial documents that Sarah had prepared, her face reflecting a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Are you telling me that our own administrator has been stealing from the palace while forcing our staff to live in deplorable conditions? How much money are we talking about?" "Over £200,000 in the past 5 years. Possibly more as we continue to examine older records," Sarah replied. "But the financial theft is only part of the problem. The more serious issue is the systematic mistreatment of palace staff who were afraid to speak up because they feared losing their jobs." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Charlotte's private secretary entered to inform her that David Richardson was requesting an urgent meeting regarding security concerns related to Sarah's ongoing activities. The timing of his request immediately raised suspicions for both women. "He knows we're getting close," Sarah observed. "I recommend that we don't alert him to the specific evidence we've gathered until we're prepared to present the complete case. There's still more investigation needed to ensure we have documented everything properly." Charlotte agreed, but she insisted on being more directly involved in the next phase of the investigation. "Inspector Matthews, I want to personally interview some of the staff members who have been affected by this situation. I need to hear directly from them about their experiences and ensure they understand that they have my complete support." Over the next 2 days, Charlotte conducted a series of private meetings with palace staff members, accompanied by Sarah, to ensure proper documentation of their statements. These conversations revealed the human cost of David Richardson's corruption in ways that financial documents could never capture. Elena Rodriguez, a young woman who worked in the palace kitchens, broke down in tears as she described living in a basement room where the heating system had been broken for over a year. She had been saving money to attend university, but had been forced to spend her savings on warm clothes and a small heater just to survive the winter months in her inadequate accommodation. "I thought this was normal," Elena explained through her tears. "I thought this was just how staff were treated, and I was grateful to have any job at all. I never imagined that there was money available to fix these problems, but that someone was choosing not to help us." Thomas Chun, a security guard who had been with the palace for 8 years, revealed that he had developed respiratory problems that he attributed to the poor air quality in his basement quarters. He had been reluctant to seek medical attention because he couldn't afford to take time off work, and he feared that health problems might result in termination. "I've seen how they treat people who cause problems," Thomas explained. "Workers who complain too much or ask for too many things just disappear. They're transferred to other positions or their contracts aren't renewed. We all learned to keep quiet and be grateful for what we had." These interviews revealed that David Richardson had deliberately created a culture of fear among the staff to prevent them from reporting problems or requesting improvements. He had used his position to intimidate workers who might threaten his corrupt arrangements, ensuring their silence through both subtle and direct threats to their job security. Charlotte was deeply affected by these personal stories, and her determination to hold Richardson accountable intensified with each interview. "These people trusted us to treat them fairly and with dignity. Instead, they were exploited and intimidated by someone who was supposed to be protecting their interests." Sarah's investigation also revealed that Richardson's corruption extended beyond the maintenance contracts. She discovered evidence that he had been manipulating staff scheduling to create opportunities for additional fraudulent billing. Overtime payments were being claimed for work that was never performed, with Richardson splitting the fraudulent payments with supervisors who were willing to participate in false documentation. The investigation took another serious turn when Sarah discovered that Richardson had been accessing confidential personnel files to identify staff members who might be vulnerable to exploitation. He had been specifically targeting employees with financial difficulties or immigration concerns, knowing that these individuals would be less likely to report problems or resist unfair treatment. Among the most disturbing discoveries was evidence that Richardson had been deliberately assigning the worst living accommodations to staff members he considered expendable, while providing better conditions to employees he thought might cause problems if they were mistreated. This systematic discrimination had created a two-tiered system within the palace staff that violated both employment law and basic principles of fairness. Sarah also uncovered communications between Richardson and certain contractors that revealed the full extent of their conspiracy. Email exchanges showed detailed discussions about how to inflate invoices, which palace officials needed to be avoided during inspections, and how to ensure that substandard work would require frequent repairs that generated additional billing opportunities. The most shocking revelation came when Sarah discovered that Richardson had been using his access to palace security systems to monitor staff members who might be considered potential threats to his operations. He had been reviewing employee communications and tracking their movements to identify anyone who might be gathering evidence of wrongdoing. This surveillance activity was not only a serious violation of privacy, but also potentially criminal, as Richardson had been using palace security resources for personal purposes. The discovery added additional charges to the growing list of offenses that Sarah was documenting for eventual prosecution. As the investigation expanded, Sarah realized that Richardson had not been operating alone. She identified at least 3 other palace administrators who had been aware of his activities and had either participated directly or had deliberately ignored obvious signs of corruption to protect their own positions. Margaret Thompson from Human Resources had clearly known about the systematic denial of maintenance requests but had chosen to process the paperwork without questioning the pattern of rejections. Her failure to escalate these concerns to higher authorities made her complicit in the ongoing mistreatment of staff members. Assistant Palace Operations Manager Kevin Walsh had been directly involved in some of the contractor arrangements and had received smaller kickback payments in exchange for his cooperation. His participation had been essential to Richardson's ability to operate his schemes without detection. Financial controller Janet Morrison had processed numerous questionable invoices without conducting proper reviews, and Sarah discovered evidence that she had received gifts from contractors that appeared to be payments for her cooperation in approving fraudulent billing. The scope of the corruption was becoming clear to both Sarah and Princess Charlotte. This was not simply a case of one corrupt administrator, but rather a network of complicit individuals who had been systematically exploiting their positions within the palace hierarchy for personal gain. Charlotte's response to these discoveries was swift and decisive. "Inspector Matthews, I want criminal charges filed against everyone who participated in this corruption. I want them prosecuted to the full extent of the law, and I want their actions made public so that everyone understands that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated." Sarah agreed with Charlotte's position, but warned that prosecuting palace administrators would likely generate significant media attention and public scrutiny. "Your Royal Highness, we need to be prepared for the possibility that this case will become a major news story that could affect public perception of the royal family." Charlotte's response reflected the moral leadership that had impressed Sarah throughout the investigation. "Inspector, my family's reputation should be built on doing what's right, not on hiding wrongdoing when it's discovered. If we don't hold these people accountable, then we become complicit in their actions." As they prepared to move forward with formal charges, both women understood that they were about to initiate a process that would have far-reaching consequences for the palace administration and potentially for the royal family itself. The investigation had revealed not just individual corruption, but systemic failures that would require comprehensive reforms to prevent similar problems in the future. The confrontation with David Richardson took place on a gray Friday morning in the palace's main conference room. Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews had coordinated with the Crown Prosecution Service to ensure that all legal procedures were properly followed, while Princess Charlotte had insisted on being present to witness Richardson's arrest personally. Richardson entered the conference room believing he had been summoned for a routine administrative meeting. His confident demeanor immediately changed when he saw Princess Charlotte seated at the head of the polished oak table, flanked by Sarah and 2 additional police officers. The reality of his situation became apparent as Sarah began reading him his rights. "David Richardson, you are under arrest on suspicion of fraud, embezzlement, abuse of office, and conspiracy to defraud," Sarah announced in her clear, professional voice. "You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court." Richardson's face went pale as the charges were read, and his eyes darted between Princess Charlotte and the assembled officers as if looking for some escape from the situation. His transformation from the confident administrator to a cornered suspect was dramatic and complete. "Your Royal Highness, I think there's been some misunderstanding," Richardson began, his voice shaking slightly. "I've always acted in the best interests of the palace and followed all established procedures." Princess Charlotte's response was measured but firm, reflecting the moral authority she had developed throughout this ordeal. "Mr. Richardson, we have extensive evidence documenting your theft of palace funds and your deliberate mistreatment of our staff members. There is no misunderstanding about your actions or their consequences." Sarah presented Richardson with a summary of the evidence that had been gathered, including financial records showing the kickback payments, email communications with co-conspirators, and documentation of his systematic denial of basic maintenance for staff accommodations. The comprehensive nature of the evidence made any denial futile. As Richardson was led away in handcuffs, Princess Charlotte addressed the remaining palace administrators who had been assembled to witness the arrest. Her message was clear and unambiguous about the standards that would be expected going forward. "Today marks the beginning of a new era in palace administration," Charlotte announced. "We will not tolerate corruption, exploitation, or mistreatment of our staff under any circumstances. Every person who works in this household deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, and anyone who violates that principle will face the full consequences of their actions." The arrests continued throughout the day as Margaret Thompson, Kevin Walsh, and Janet Morrison were taken into custody for their roles in the corruption network. Each arrest sent a clear message to the remaining palace staff that accountability would be enforced at all levels of the organization. The media reaction to the arrests was immediate and intense. News outlets across the country covered the story extensively, with many praising Princess Charlotte's decisive action, while others questioned how such corruption had been allowed to flourish within the royal household. Charlotte faced the media scrutiny with characteristic grace, using the attention to highlight her commitment to reform. In her first public statement following the arrests, Charlotte addressed the nation with remarkable candor about the failures that had been discovered and her plans for preventing similar problems in the future. The people who work in our household are not just employees. They are partners in maintaining an institution that serves the British people. When we fail them, we fail in our most basic responsibilities. The criminal proceedings moved forward rapidly as the evidence against Richardson and his co-conspirators was overwhelming. Richardson ultimately pleaded guilty to multiple charges and was sentenced to 4 years in prison, along with being ordered to pay full restitution for the funds he had stolen. The other defendants received shorter sentences, but were also required to make financial restitution. Meanwhile, Princess Charlotte worked tirelessly to implement comprehensive reforms within the palace administration. She established new oversight mechanisms to ensure that staff welfare concerns would be addressed promptly and transparently. A staff advocacy program was created to provide employees with confidential channels for reporting problems without fear of retaliation. The basement quarters that had sparked the original investigation were completely renovated within 3 months of Richardson's arrest. The cramped, deteriorating rooms were transformed into comfortable, modern accommodations that reflected the respect and dignity that palace staff deserved. The renovation project became a symbol of the new priorities that Charlotte had established. Maria Santos, whose terrible living conditions had been among the first that Charlotte had discovered, was given the honor of cutting the ribbon at the reopening ceremony for the renovated staff quarters. Speaking to the assembled crowd, Maria expressed gratitude for Princess Charlotte's commitment to justice and reform. Princess Charlotte didn't just fix our rooms, Maria said with tears in her eyes. She fixed our lives. She showed us that we matter, that our comfort and dignity are important, and that someone in authority was willing to fight for us when we couldn't fight for ourselves. The renovation project cost significantly less than the money that had been stolen through Richardson's corruption schemes, demonstrating how easily the problems could have been addressed if honest administration had been in place. The contrast highlighted the needless suffering that the staff had endured due to one man's greed. Charlotte also implemented a new budget transparency system that required detailed public reporting of all palace expenditures related to staff welfare and facility maintenance. This transparency measure ensured that future administrators would not be able to hide neglect or redirect funds without detection. The investigation led to broader reforms within other royal residences as well. Charlotte coordinated with administrators at Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, and other royal properties to conduct comprehensive reviews of staff accommodations and administrative procedures. Several additional problems were identified and corrected before they could develop into serious issues. 6 months after the arrests, Princess Charlotte established an annual staff appreciation program that included significant bonuses for dedicated employees, enhanced benefit packages, and guaranteed accommodation standards that exceeded industry norms. The program demonstrated her ongoing commitment to ensuring that palace staff were treated as valued members of the royal household. Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews received recognition from both the royal family and the Metropolitan Police for her thorough and professional handling of the investigation. Her work had not only uncovered serious crimes, but had also helped restore integrity to an important British institution. Charlotte personally recommended Sarah for promotion within the Royal Protection Unit. The relationship between Princess Charlotte and the palace staff was transformed by the events that had unfolded. Staff members who had previously felt voiceless and vulnerable now saw Charlotte as an advocate who would listen to their concerns and take action when necessary. The culture of fear that Richardson had cultivated was replaced by an atmosphere of mutual respect and open communication. Thomas Chun, the security guard who had developed health problems due to poor living conditions, received comprehensive medical treatment paid for by the palace and was provided with excellent new accommodations. His respiratory problems improved significantly once he was moved to a properly ventilated room with adequate heating and humidity control. Elena Rodriguez, the kitchen worker who had been forced to spend her savings on dealing with heating problems, received a scholarship fund that allowed her to attend university while continuing her palace employment part-time. Charlotte personally presented the scholarship, acknowledging Elena's resilience and dedication despite the hardships she had faced. The reforms implemented by Princess Charlotte became a model for other large institutions dealing with similar challenges. Her approach of combining thorough investigation, swift accountability, and comprehensive reform attracted attention from organizations around the world that were struggling with issues of administrative corruption and employee welfare. A year after the original investigation began, Princess Charlotte hosted a reception for all palace staff members to celebrate the progress that had been made and to reaffirm her ongoing commitment to their welfare. The event was held in the newly renovated staff quarters, symbolizing the transformation that had taken place. This past year has taught us all important lessons about leadership, accountability, and the responsibilities we have to one another, Charlotte told the assembled staff members. We faced difficult truths about failures in our organization, but we also discovered the strength that comes from addressing problems honestly and working together to create positive change. The investigation that had begun with Princess Charlotte's simple demand to find out who's responsible had ultimately transformed the palace administration and established new standards for institutional accountability. The young royal's courage in confronting uncomfortable truths and demanding justice had not only solved immediate problems, but had created lasting improvements that would benefit future generations of palace staff. Sarah Matthews often reflected on the investigation that had defined her career and the remarkable leadership that Princess Charlotte had demonstrated throughout the process. The detective had witnessed many powerful people faced with evidence of wrongdoing in their organizations, but she had never seen anyone respond with such unwavering commitment to justice and reform. The story became a testament to the power of moral leadership and the importance of holding institutions accountable to the values they claim to represent. Princess Charlotte had proven that true authority comes not from avoiding difficult situations, but from facing them with integrity and determination to do what is right, regardless of the personal or political costs involved.